At 76, King Charles finally speaks. And what did he reveal? The world wasn't ready. Hidden for decades, his secret about Diana's death changes everything. Was it guilt, grief, or something darker? This confession doesn't just shake the royal family. It rewrites history. And yes, there's unseen footage. But why now? Why after all these years? One thing is clear, this truth was never meant to be heard. Until now. It began in the countryside, quiet and unassuming. A shooting party hosted at the Spencer family estate in Althorp would change the course of British history. Not through politics, nor war, but through a glance. Prince Charles, 29 years old, the heir to the throne and the most sought-after bachelor in Britain, wasn't there looking for love. He came as a guest of Sarah Spencer, the woman he was quietly dating. But fate, mischievous and merciless, had other plans. Among the guests was a teenage girl with wide eyes and a startling sense of poise. 16-year-old Diana Spencer. She wasn't supposed to be the star of the day, but her energy, light, playful, oddly magnetic, shifted the entire atmosphere. And Charles noticed it wasn't love at first sight. Not in the conventional sense. But there was something. A pull. While Sarah mingled, Charles found himself watching Diana, intrigued by her innocence, her warmth, and the way she floated through conversations with ease. She wasn't trying to impress him, and that's what made her unforgettable. Diana would later call that encounter the moment everything changed. She had no idea she was standing on the edge of destiny. He, the future king. She was the girl who would become a global icon. But if this was fate, it would burn beautifully before breaking hearts. The age gap was undeniable, 13 years apart, and in any other context, it would have sparked unease. But this was royalty, and the crown operated on its own rules. What mattered wasn't compatibility or emotional readiness. It was an image, duty, appearances. And Diana, even as a teenager, looked the part. Elegant lineage, graceful presence. She fit the mold before she even knew she was being shaped for it. But while Charles was drawn to her spirit, was it admiration or projection? Did he see Diana for who she was, or what she could become? That question would haunt the story that followed. And yet, the irony was almost cruel. At that moment, Charles wasn't free to pursue Diana. His involvement with Sarah Spencer complicated things, and for a while, it seemed like that brief flicker of connection would be nothing more than a forgotten anecdote from a countryside gathering. He returned to Sarah and even vacationed with her in Switzerland. Diana drifted back into her world, but something had shifted, quietly, invisibly, and permanently. Diana wasn't chasing a prince. She wasn't dreaming of crowns, but she remembered him. The quiet way he spoke, the strange sadness in his eyes. She remembered the curiosity, the attention he gave her, however brief. And in a life soon to be consumed by cameras and headlines, that moment of innocent recognition became one of her last untouched memories. A time before the palace, before betrayal, before the world turned her into myth. But the story didn't end there. Not even close. Because, as fate would have it, that brief encounter wasn't a chapter. It was the prologue. A royal spark had been lit, and though it would take time to ignite into full flame, the embers were already glowing. The world didn't know it yet, but a royal fairy tale had begun writing itself, and hidden in its pages were secrets far too dark for a storybook ending. But as the public watched a fairy tale unfold, darker truths were silently brewing behind palace walls. Behind every royal proposal, there's a story. But this one hid a secret heartbreak, one that would quietly echo through the grand halls of Buckingham Palace and into the very soul of a princess. Just 6 months after their paths crossed again, Prince Charles proposed to Diana. It was sudden, breathtaking, and for Diana, disorienting. There was no space to pause, no time to truly reflect. The momentum of the monarchy was already pushing her forward, and she, just 19 years old, was swept up in it. For the public, it was a love story fit for the ages. For Diana, it was the beginning of a life she hadn't yet chosen. The ring itself was stunning. A 12-carat oval sapphire encircled by 14 solitaire diamonds, set in white gold. Inspired by a brooch once owned by Queen Victoria, it was as much a royal symbol as it was a declaration. But symbols can be deceiving. While the world gasped at its beauty, Diana barely had time to process its weight, not just on her finger, but on her future. That ring wasn't just a gift, it was a crown in disguise, and with it came expectations Diana didn't fully understand. She wasn't marrying a man. She was marrying a monarchy, and yet the engagement announcement seemed flawless. The media celebrated her youth, her beauty, her fairy tale rise. The monarchy, battered by criticism and desperate for public favor, found in Diana the perfect answer. She brought warmth to an institution long accused of coldness. The people adored her, and the palace saw an opportunity for stability, maybe even redemption. But beneath the polished smiles and formal photographs, a fracture was already forming. It happened during their first televised interview. A journalist, smiling, asked if the couple was in love. Diana answered instantly, "Of course." But Charles hesitated. His eyes dropped. Then came the now infamous words, "Whatever love means." The nation laughed nervously. Diana didn't. That single sentence would haunt her. It was more than awkwardness. It was truth disguised as ambiguity. A warning disguised as charm. And no one heard it louder than Diana herself. The signs were there, subtle, dismissed. But they were real, and they were growing. The fairy tale glimmered, but cracks shimmered beneath the surface. Diana, still new to the world of titles and protocols, began to feel the walls closing in. She smiled for the cameras, waved for the crowds, posed beside her prince. But inside, she was already questioning everything. The pressure to be perfect had begun its slow, crushing descent. And though she wore the ring with grace, the question lingered in the quiet. Was this truly love? Or was she simply filling a royal vacancy? And as wedding bells rang louder, Diana's heart whispered something wasn't right. Million people watched what they believed was the perfect fairy tale. A radiant bride, a historic cathedral, and the heir to the British throne exchanging vows in front of the world. It was grand, majestic, an illusion spun so brilliantly that no one noticed the cracks forming beneath the gold. But Diana did, and she saw them long before the aisle. Just days before the wedding, her world tilted violently. Hidden in a drawer, wrapped in secrecy, she found a bracelet. It wasn't hers. It was engraved with the initials G and F, symbols of Charles to Bind, and Camilla's private bond. That discovery was no mistake. It was a warning, quietly screaming from within palace walls. The man she was about to marry was still emotionally tethered to someone else. Diana's heart sank, but the machine around her was already moving too, fast to stop. She wanted to run. She thought about it. The urge to escape wasn't just emotional. It was physical. She felt trapped, betrayed. Like a beautifully dressed pawn in a centuries-old game, she didn't fully understand. But when she confided in her sister, hoping for permission to walk away, she was met with pressure disguised as reason. "Too late," her sister said. "Your face is already on the tea towels." The gravity of those words hit harder than any crown ever could. Her doubts were swallowed by duty. Her heartbreak was hidden beneath the silk and lace of what would become the most-watched wedding in modern history. July 29, 1981, was a day of national celebration. Diana, just 20, stepped into the global spotlight in an ivory silk taffeta, gown embroidered with pearls and dreams she no longer believed in. The world watched her with awe, but no one saw the panic behind her eyes. And then, the ceremony itself, meant to seal a destiny, turned into a cascade of missteps that seemed to mock the illusion of perfection. Diana stumbled over Charles's full name, calling him Philip Charles instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. Charles, in turn, misspoke his vows. And the final nail in the fragile image? He forgot to kiss his bride. Not once. Not at the altar. It took the roar of a crowd outside Buckingham Palace to remind him. And even then, the kiss was forced, more spectacle than sincerity. Still, the public remained enchanted. They were, too, busy being swept away by the magic. The gifts flooded in, 3,000 from across the globe, tokens of love and admiration. A hand-cut glass bowl from the Reagans, rare jewelry from Saudi royalty. Every corner of the world contributed to the performance. But Diana, she was crumbling inside. Her gown, her jewels, her smile, none of it could hide the weight pressing on her soul. She had entered the cathedral with doubts and left with chains disguised as vows. This wasn't the beginning of her happily ever after. It was the start of her silent war. Behind the smiles, a different story was unfolding, one that would end in betrayal. They were supposed to be the answer, the hope, the glue that would finally bind a fragile union into something lasting. When Prince William was born, the world rejoiced. And so did Diana. In that hospital room, for a fleeting moment, she felt something real, joy untouched by protocol. She held her son close, not as a princess, but as a mother clinging to the one pure thing in a life quickly slipping beyond her control. Prince Charles stood by her side, the cameras captured their smiles, and newspapers hailed the birth as the next great chapter in the monarchy's future. But behind closed doors, the cracks in their marriage deepened. No matter how many headlines tried to paint over them, Diana was spiraling. The pressure to be perfect, to smile for the cameras, to play her part without flaw. It consumed her. Her inner battles, hidden from public view, became unbearable. She felt isolated in a palace filled with people, adored by a public that never truly saw her. The desperation grew, and in a moment of unimaginable anguish, she threw herself down a staircase while pregnant. The world would never see that version of the fairy tale, but Diana lived it and survived it. Though the fall didn't harm the baby, it marked a terrifying escalation in her emotional collapse. Her cry for help was met with silence, or worse, dismissal. When Prince Harry arrived, Diana hoped for a fresh start, a second chance. But that fragile hope shattered the moment she shared the news with Charles. Instead of celebration, he let slip a comment that cut deeper than any silence. He had hoped for a girl. The weight of that disappointment didn't just fall on Diana. It fell on their marriage, on her heart, and on the trust that was already fading fast. While the public marveled at the perfect royal family, behind the palace doors, Diana watched the man she once believed in drift further away. And she knew exactly where he was drifting. To someone he had never truly left behind. Camilla, the shadow that never disappeared. By 1989, Diana could no longer ignore what was obvious. The whispers, the subtle glances, the private calls. It all pointed to one truth. Charles had reignited the flame with his former lover. And this time, Diana wasn't going to suffer in silence. At a birthday party, surrounded by the very elite who upheld the illusion, she walked up to Camilla and confronted her with raw, devastating honesty. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said, her voice steady, her pain barely concealed. It was one of the most courageous acts of her life. And yet, it changed nothing. Because while Diana was fighting for her marriage, Charles had already made his choice. The affair would continue. The distance between them would grow, and Diana, once the glowing bride of a national dream, was now a woman lost in a palace of ghosts. Her fairy tale had turned into quiet devastation, and soon, private heartbreak would explode into a global scandal. It began with a phone call never meant to be heard. Whispers exchanged between 2 lovers in the shadows, dripping with desire, captured on tape and unleashed upon the world. What followed wasn't just scandal. It was an earthquake that shattered the image of the most guarded institution in Britain. Camilla Gate. One word, one leak. And suddenly, the illusion of a royal fairy tale dissolved into fragments of exposed truth. In the infamous recording, Charles's words to Camilla weren't just intimate. They were explicit, humiliating, and impossible to deny. This wasn't speculation. This was raw proof of a marriage betrayed. And for Diana, it was confirmation of what she had known all along. She had been fighting a ghost she could never erase. The monarchy scrambled. Damage control kicked in, but it was too late. The veil had lifted, and behind it stood a prince no longer immune to judgment. Then, in 1994, Prince Charles made a move no royal had dared before. In a televised interview with journalist Jonathan Dimbleby, he admitted to the affair. The world watched, breathless, as the heir to the throne confessed what tradition demanded he deny. His justification? That he had remained faithful until the marriage became irretrievably broken. It was a line carefully constructed, but one that rang hollow for a public now fully immersed in the private torment of their royal icons. But Diana wasn't finished. She refused to let Charles's narrative become the only one. In 1995, she sat down for an interview that would go down in history, not just for its revelations, but for its raw, disarming honesty. The BBC Panorama interview wasn't just television. It was a reckoning. With quiet power, Diana confirmed what the world already suspected. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said, her voice calm, her eyes unwavering. And in that single sentence, she turned sympathy into solidarity. The victim had found her voice, and the world listened. Public loyalty shifted overnight. Diana was no longer just the wronged wife. She was the woman who stood alone against the machine. The palace, bound by its codes of silence, remained distant and cold. But Diana had become something more powerful than a royal figure. She had become a symbol of truth, of pain, of resilience in the face of betrayal. While Charles faced ridicule, Diana was embraced. Yet with the public's affection came unbearable exposure. Her heartbreak, once whispered behind palace doors, was now dissected by the press, analyzed by commentators, and devoured by tabloids. Her private suffering had become global entertainment. There was no turning back. The fantasy was over. And the damage is irreversible. And though Buckingham Palace continued to present a front of decorum, the inevitability could no longer be delayed. The divorce was coming. And for Diana, the unraveling of her marriage wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the collapse of the life she had been forced to build. She had endured humiliation in silence for years, but now the entire world knew the cost. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was broadcast, consumed, burned into the legacy of a future king. But what came next was no ordinary divorce. It was a quiet war with global eyes watching. She finally broke free. The palace doors no longer confined her. The crown no longer defined her. But freedom, for Diana, didn't feel like victory. It felt like exile. Her marriage was over, the papers were signed, and the world declared its closure. But in truth, it was only the beginning of a different kind of struggle. No longer a wife, no longer Her Royal Highness. Diana stood alone, stripped of the title but not of scrutiny. She was still the most photographed woman in the world, still adored, still hunted. And as she stepped into her new chapter, the shadows followed close behind. She poured herself into causes that truly mattered. Landmine victims, AIDS patients, homeless shelters. Diana wasn't just shaking hands anymore. She was holding them, looking into eyes others ignored. The compassion that once charmed a nation now became her compass. And yet, even in her most selfless moments, the press reduced her to headlines. Her style, her lovers, her past. The story was always spun, always twisted. While Diana tried to reshape her identity, the world insisted on boxing her in. Still, she moved forward with grace, living at Kensington Palace, walking the tightrope between royalty and rebellion. The title, Princess of Wales, remained hers, a symbolic tether to a kingdom she had both captivated and defied. And in the rare, quiet moments, she found something unexpected: love. Dr. Hasnat Khan, a heart and lung surgeon, a man who understood the pressure but never sought the spotlight. Their relationship was unlike any she'd known. Private, grounded, safe, but even love couldn't escape the paparazzi. The more they tried to protect what they had, the more the press stalked them. The scrutiny became suffocating. Hasnat, a man of logic and silence, couldn't endure the relentless invasion. And Diana, torn between a love she craved and a life she couldn't escape, watched it unravel. Their 2-year romance ended, not with betrayal, but with exhaustion. What followed was a blur of rumors. Men she was seen with suddenly became lovers in the tabloids. A hand on a shoulder became a scandal. A dinner became an affair. The truth faded under the weight of gossip. Diana tried to rise above it, but every step forward was met with another headline dragging her back. Her name sold millions, and no one asked what it cost her. The cameras that once framed her as a princess now hunted her as prey. Then came Dodi Al-Fayed, and a summer that would turn deadly. One tunnel, one night, one moment that changed everything. It was August 31st, 1997 in Paris, just past midnight. Diana, Dodi Al-Fayed, and their driver, Henri Paul, sped away from the Ritz, desperate to outrun the relentless pack of paparazzi who had followed their every step that summer. They weren't just fleeing flashing cameras. They were running from a life that had never belonged to them. A life where privacy was a luxury and peace was always interrupted. But as their black Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the chase took a turn from dangerous to deadly. What was supposed to be a quiet escape became the final chapter of a story that had already been soaked in pain. The crash was brutal. Henri Paul, later found to be intoxicated, lost control of the vehicle at high speed. Dodi and the driver died instantly. Diana, still alive in the wreckage, clung to life for as long as her broken body allowed. But even as she was being pulled from the wreckage, the cameras kept clicking. Even in death, she was still being consumed by the same machine that never gave her room to breathe. The woman who had once been the crown's greatest promise now lay motionless. Another, victim of the very fame that made her untouchable and tragically exposed. In the days before the crash, there had been signs of change. Charles had visited Diana for her birthday. Their last interaction was surprisingly warm, playful even. They had tea. She teased him about reclaiming old furniture. He laughed. It was a moment, small and unassuming, but different. Something about it hinted at healing. That maybe, after all the pain, the distance, the betrayal, they could find peace. But fate had already made its choice. And that fragile window closed as suddenly as it had opened. News of Diana's death spread like wildfire. The world stood still. Mourning turned into a global phenomenon. Crowds flooded London. Flowers blanketed the gates of Kensington Palace. For once, silence echoed louder than headlines. But one detail sparked quiet curiosity. At the funeral, Prince Charles wore navy, not black. It was a subtle defiance of protocol, a personal rebellion wrapped in tradition. Some saw it as a mistake. Others saw it for what it truly was, a quiet, aching tribute. A nod to a woman he had once loved, lost, and perhaps never truly understood. A color that said more than words ever could. And yet, beneath the mourning, something darker stirred. The grief was real, but so was the anger. The public wanted answers. The monarchy, frozen in centuries-old tradition, offered none. And as Diana was laid to rest, the questions only grew louder. Because while the world wept, the royal silence was deafening. But as the world mourned, the royal family came under fire, and King Charles was never the same again. He waited decades, but now King Charles is finally speaking, and it's darker than anyone imagined. After a lifetime spent walking within the confines of royal duty, bound by silence, protocol, and 1,000 unspoken rules, he has broken the wall. In his 76th year, older, more reflective, stripped of illusion, Charles is no longer the young prince with rehearsed answers and guarded expressions. Now, he speaks as a man haunted by the past, and in his voice, there's something raw, something unmistakably real. He doesn't offer excuses, he offers confessions. For the first time, Charles has admitted what the world suspected, but never heard from his lips. He failed her. Not just as a husband, but as a man who should have fought harder. In private footage, never meant for broadcast, Charles is seen speaking during the filming of a confidential royal documentary commissioned for archival purposes. The conversation drifts to Diana, and what begins as a routine reflection turns into something far more vulnerable. He speaks of their wedding day, not with fondness, but with confusion. "We were too young," he says, "too broken, too different." Then, quietly, he adds, "I didn't fight for her. I should have." He goes further. He reveals the toll their crumbling marriage took on him, not publicly, but internally. The sleepless nights, the guilt, the sense that, no matter how much the world painted Diana as the people's princess and him as the villain, there was a deeper truth no one could see. "I carried it with me," he admits. Her sadness, her silence, her strength. All of it. When the footage cuts to a pause, Charles looks down and then speaks of a memory that still grips him, one he can't shake. It was the last time they saw each other. A spontaneous visit for her birthday. Tea in the sitting room. She laughed at him, teasing, accusing him of coming to retrieve his furniture. They both laughed. It felt light, like maybe we were finally okay. And then, days later, she was gone. Insiders say he carries that moment like a scar, a flash of peace before the storm no one saw coming. And though he's never spoken of it publicly, those closest to him say it changed him permanently. He began keeping her photos closer, visiting her resting place when no one was watching. And while the monarchy demanded forward motion, Charles remained partially anchored in that single, final moment. The confession, once leaked, shook the palace. The footage wasn't supposed to surface, but once it did, the response was seismic. Some saw it as redemption, others too little too late. But one thing was clear: this was not the Charles the public had known. This was not the scripted sovereign or the guarded heir. This was a man burdened by a history he helped write and could never rewrite. His words reopened old wounds, but also answered questions no statement ever had. Because, when the crown is finally laid to rest, will the truth finally bring peace, or haunt the legacy forever? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.